if we look at the last few years of polling, it's destructive. It's not supporting of democracy. We've seen it roll prime ministers. We've seen it become the talking point and feed the 24-hour news cycle in itself.
Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.
Mark, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Tell me what got you into this industry. It's a fascinating field to be in. I'm sure you never do a day's work but have endless fun.
No, that's right. Thanks, Dave. Great to be with you. Well, I have always had interest in people. After school, went off to do a psychology degree, and as I moved through that, I found that I was more interested in the social psychology, the sociology, how groups and communities interact. And so I, after that, did a master's in sociology and dug a bit deeper in this field. And that's now what fills my time, is conducting social research and demographic studies, just to get that deeper analysis of communities and groups and segments, and getting a sense on where that's taking us.
I did a interview with, I can't remember his name right now, I'm sorry to him, but a celebrated Canadian economics professor. And I think most people, when they hear the word economics, think money. And he described himself as somebody who, and economics generally, not just himself, he wasn't saying it was peculiar, but general, that economics is the study of behaviours and predictable behaviours of groups. And they will, hypothesize a model and then test it in the real world and compare how that went. It sounds a little bit similar to you. Do you delve in economics much in that kind of sense?
Yeah, that's right. Economics is one of the key aspects of human interactions of community. Money and the earning of that, the spending of that, sentiment and attitudes around that. So that comes into it, as do broader priorities or attitudes to different policies, or fears of the future, or hopes and dreams. I mean, anything that is very true to the human experience is what we want to research. And that old saying, what's most personal is most universal, does drive our social research. And to get data around that is important. Yes, data on the behaviors, on the practices, but also on the attitudes and expectations, the sentiment. So it's both of those that really create a picture of society and the direction in which we're headed.
Now, Robert Menzies was somebody who coined the phrase, I believe it was Robert Menzies coined the phrase, the battlers, the Aussie battlers. And then we had, perhaps that was John Howard. I might be getting my phrases confused, but the most recent of all examples of people trying to describe a majority political sentiment might have been the recent federal election with Scott Morrison, using the phrase, the quiet Australian. Tell me, is this a self-serving, wishful thinking kind of proposition, or is there a accurate description of the majority of Australians in their political philosophy? And I don't mean how would they describe themselves in a survey, but in actual reality. Is there a general majority that is conservative or progressive?
There is a big majority of Australians that are common sense, that are going about their day, and that see a lot of the political machinations and indeed a lot of the media commentary and say, well, that doesn't resonate with me. And whether you call it the Howard Battlers or the quiet Australians, Australians are common sense. It's the land of the fair go. It's the land where we talk about things passing the pub test, where people say, well, that just doesn't smell right. There's a sense that Australians, when they discuss things in the suburbs, which are the great melting pot of our nation, tend to be, we talk about the kitchen table, they tend to just deal with the fair income. And much of what we read in political coverage doesn't really speak to them and doesn't describe them. Keep in mind that a lot of journalists are what we might call from the more elite element in terms of their background, in terms of where they're living, and in terms of the perspective that they have. That the Canberra Press Gallery is the same. It's a group of people that connect with each other, but certainly don't represent what we often call mainstream Australia. And that's the great thing about our nation and our democracy. It's very diverse, and across that diversity, when you put an issue to them or you get a poll conducted, Australians tend to get it right. That's the great thing. And if things head too far one way, there's a bit of a correction mechanism. That's on what all of research is based, that if you can get a sample that represents the Australian population and have accurate questions and methodologies behind that, what is true of that sample is true of the population. And I'm consistently impressed with how Australians, when you get that cross-section of them, tend to have a common sense view of their world and their life. And you don't always get that just by hearing the elite or the commentariat or the political or journalistic class speaking.
Mm. Now, you said something about getting the samples right, which really prompts a question that I hadn't considered before you said that. And that is, how does the American media elite and the Australian media elite get the polling before a federal election so devastatingly wrong?
Well, a lot of it was not scientific polling. It was polling that was not fully representative. They were just going with the panels that they had access to, mostly that were more informed, that were digitally connected, that were on these research panels to begin with. And they were polling particularly people that were not in some of those harder to access communities or areas. So there was a biased sample for a start. Secondly, such was the intense political coverage and angst in the lead up to whether it be Brexit or whether it be the US elections around Trump, that no one on a phone interview, we call it caddy, computer-aided telephone interview, speaking to a pollster, wanted to put forward their view that actually, what seems to be mainstream, that everyone's heading towards the left or everyone's all about the UK staying in Europe, is not a politically correct view to hold. And so the concept of the quiet Tories did come to the pass. Now there is robocalling now. There are a lot of online surveys where it's de-identified and where you're not talking to a pollster. And so that does remove at least that hang up, where people can be a bit more honest because they're not talking to someone and they feel that they're not going to be looked at strangely because of their political view. But that wasn't what was making up a lot of the polling, and so it certainly got it wrong.
Is it possible to get it right? Is that something McCrindle research could break into in a field that gets it so wrong so often and create this amazingly accurate, valuable product to replace the current failed models?
Well, we have a problem with polling just ideologically. If we look at the last few years of polling, it's destructive. It's not supporting of democracy. We've seen it roll prime ministers. We've seen it become the talking point and feed the 24-hour news cycle in itself. There would be a poll, and then there'd be discussions about a poll, and then another poll that saw that because of the discussions about the poll, it was heading further south. It's just not something that adds to a society, that builds up a society, and that adds a lot of heat, not a lot of light. Our focus is to empower human flourishing as an organization. We want to conduct research that can inform the communities in which we're planted and that can empower them and can offer direction to them rather than something that's divisive or can be used for political wedge politics. So I just don't think polling is a positive mechanism. Now there are policy polls that can be taken place. We do a lot of research. If someone's looking at a particular policy or looking to develop policy or direction, what does the public think on this? What are some insights we can gather from this? That's fantastic. But polling for the sense of making it public so that it can create tension for a political party or put them on the back foot in a media interview, I think it tears down more than it builds up, and it's just not the business we're in.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and I think you're right. I think it's an accurate observation based on just observable sequence of events. But conceptually, hypothetically, you would have thought surveying and polling a population would be precisely democratic. It's almost, constantly taking the pulse of people's opinion. How are we doing? Should we keep going like this? But you're right. It's been thoroughly toxically weaponized by cynical political and media elites. It's a good observation, and I guess it's a good choice to stay out of it if you want to be positive and constructive. Tell me, the research and data that you have had talking about the quiet Australian and Howard's battlers, John Howard and Robert Menzies, the two longest serving governments, prime ministerships in Australian history. Is there a change in the philosophical landscape of Australia over the last century, 120 years? Is it subtle, or is there a pretty consistent trend to it, despite what many people would point to in the changing demographic of people responding to no religion?
Well, there are changes, that's for sure. There are changes in the electorate. There are changes in our population that flow in various directions, by the way. It's not as though we're headed on a one-way street away from conservatism or towards more radical thought or whatever. But there are some trends in that regard. One of those is increasing university education. And the fact is that people move through our higher education system, having spent 4 years there, and it does have a particular political angle. It does lean very much left, and that does inform some worldviews and outcomes, and that's the direction that young people are headed. 9 in 10 young people now finish year 12. Now, Dave, when you and I were at school and moving into our senior years, half the class left at year 10. That's just how it was back then. That's not the case now. It's towards this ongoing conveyor belt of education, and particularly leading towards more higher education. We've got skill shortages in the trades. It's harder to get young people into TAFE and vocational education so they can get out there and get those jobs that are so needed and have such a great financial and job security in their future. Those in construction and those in the trades and traineeships and clerical areas. We need that. They're the backbone of this nation and our growth. And it's harder to get young people there. And if we think about the battlers, if we think about the tradies, if we think about the high vis communities that have been common sense voters and see a policy that might be a bit beyond where Australians are at, and we'll call that out. That's definitely still a cohort, but it's harder to get young people into those fields and those areas. So that's a trend. You identified the trend of declining connection with Christianity, and we've seen in a decade the numbers go from 64% identifying as Christian to 51%. So that's been quite a decline. When the results come out from this most recent census, I've little doubt that it'll be in minority share. Will have slipped below that 50% line, but still, that's a very large minority of the population, almost half, identifying as Christians. So we need to keep that in mind. Sometimes I think we can overstate this mantra of post-Christian and non-religious and hard soil and not interested in the Judeo-Christian foundations. That's not the case from the data. That's not to say all of those half of the population that identify as identify their faith as, or the religion as Christianity, are practicing of that and understand the tenets of that. They don't, but still, it's a big proportion of the nation, even though it's in decline. And we've got an increasingly leveraged commentariat. I mentioned those in the political class and those journalists that have the organs of communication in their hands, and that definitely leans in a particular direction. And they have inordinate influence these days through not only the mainstream news channels and the blogs and the apps and the news sites, but social media as well, which is another whole area that is decidedly left in its leanings. So we definitely have some leverage there that's headed in a particular direction. But at the same time, if we think about counter trends there in the Australian population, we've got and are built on migration. And it's in those migrant communities that, again, you have that common sense that are not easily influenced by, again, the Canberra Press Gallery or some of the leading journalistic voices or influences. They look to their own communities and their own community networks, and so that's a counter trend. And you've got emerging voices that just flow from when policy or perspectives head in one direction, you'll invariably end up with a counter trend. And we're starting to see a bit of that as well. Water sort of finds its own level and it heads in one direction and then it swings back. And the Australian electorate is a lot like that. So as extreme as things get around gender issues or around some policy issues that seem a long way from anything around sanctity of life, you'll end up with a counter trend where people say, that policy, that perspective has gone too far. And those sometimes that have the political power do end up in overreach. And that's where the old Aussie saying of they get a kick in the shins at the next poll, the next ballot box, and that does recorrect the playing field. And that's what we've had consistently in Australia. And that's why things inevitably flow back to the centre, even if they've gone a little bit far to the left.
Now, do you think we're in a season where that kind of recalibration or kick in the shins is overdue, and inevitable at the next or following election, or is that a little bit too hard to call?
We're starting to see it a bit now, aren't we, around some of the hardline policies around lockdowns and COVID restrictions, and we're seeing, the consensus of the electorate. We're very compliant as Australians, but we're seeing a little bit of that break out a bit and break down and the pushback on that. And I think that does send a bit of a message. We think that politicians lead, and they do have a great role in leadership. They are invested by the electorate and by our compliant population with leadership. We're not like America, where we believe in conspiracies. We're not like some parts of Europe where we consistently push back on authority. We don't have the rise of, we don't have the history of World War II and dictatorships and extreme leaders that Europe has, that creates in them a healthy distrust of authority. Australians are amazingly compliant. We saw that in the first part of COVID. Australians, we out Singapored Singapore. I mean, talk about a compliant nation. Singapore is that one, right? Where they just get on board with.
This totally surprises me, because the narrative we hear constantly is that Australians are rebellious, distrusting of authority, and non-compliant, based on the alleged convict identity that is ubiquitous to our culture. And yet, I mean, I've been shocked, ashamed, and heartbroken at the readiness with which Australians have freely handed over their liberty and their civil rights in some slavish, idolatrous worship of safetyism. Explain to me how we got this identity so wrong, and we, as you said, out Singapored Singapore.
Well, we probably think of ourselves a bit like the rest of the West, whether it be the US or whether it be some key countries in Europe. We compare ourselves with them, and they're individualistic, and they value that individualism and those rights. We are actually more collectivist in mindset and behavior than we often think we are. We're community minded. We look out for others. We call ourselves the lucky country because no one is self-made. It's all through community and the welfare of others that we get by. We do, therefore, we've got a tolerance for bigger government and for government institutions because of that. You know, we Medicare has universal acceptance. We roll out the NDIS, and Australians get behind that. We're not highly suspicious of government agencies. You know, Centrelink and Service New South Wales and the various state government services are generally well supported. So we do have this common sense perspective that we entrust government to look after the people, but we still, you know, value that hard work and that Judeo-Christian, you know, work ethic. But, you know, there is a welfare support for those who are down on their luck, as we say, or doing it tough. And so we've got this more moderated view than you have in the US, and we can't just import that individualism and think it applies here. And I think we saw the best of that collectivism in the early months of COVID, where Australians were locking themselves down before there were any health restrictions. And the common sense of that played out well in how we went for that first year. But the problem is that some government leaders have read that compliance as almost compliance to their own authority, that the population, the electorates, are complying with their strong leadership. And I think that was a misread. Australians in their common sense corner were locking themselves down and complying out of a sense that we are needing to do this as a community to ensure this thing doesn't spread. But if the leaders misread it and thought that it was a vote in their authoritarianism, and that they have written as the electorate a blank check to leaders to continue to throw around their weight or power, and that compliance will remain unchecked, they've misread it, because that wasn't what it was. It was giving the benefit of the doubt to leaders and health officials. Importantly, it was evidence-based advice. Australians were saying, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. We'll go with you on this journey. We will lock ourselves down even where we see, there isn't a policy in place for the sake of getting this thing done. But as it's stretched on, Australians have also, back at the kitchen table, said, you know what, I think we're done now. I think we can see a way through this where we perhaps can live with it to some extent. And those leaders that still think that they've got that full vote of support to continue in the policies that they applied early on with full compliance, and they think they can continue to apply that and maintain that full compliance. I think it's the ego, and they've lost a little bit of a sense of the compact under which leadership has always worked in Australia, which is this deal, which is this mutual trust and this mutual respect, and the overreach we're starting now to see.
So explain to me, if you can, the origins, the foundation, because like I said, we've been told over and over again, we're a convict nation that distrusts authority and we're rebellious. So if we're now seeing that we're compliant and very community focused and willing to trust government, at least initially, and in my opinion, for far too long and far too much, then where does this compliance and government dependence come from if it's been misdiagnosed that we've got this fierce spirit of individualism based on colonial convict roots?
Well, you know, those settlers in Australia and the early colonies had to rely on each other because this is a pretty tough land on which to support a whole bunch of people who are suddenly arriving from Europe. And so the early settlements and the early governments in Australia really had to rely on on the people. I mean, you see that with land grants, and you see it with the freeing of convicts, that the government had to give freedoms and land and resource and empowering to the people for the survival of those colonies, because they were exposed, and people did band together to get it done. Now, they got it done without the hierarchy that took place in Europe, in England particularly, without the class system. So it had egalitarianism, it had community mindedness, it had people working together, and with the goodwill and support of government. So both were part of this compact. The government needed those ex-convicts and indeed the free settlers to make a go of things. And as they made a go of things, they got more land grants, they got more resource, they got more support. And that's still the way it is. That we've got a self-completion tax system. You fill in the tax, and there's a compact that we will trust you. If you are shown up, you may well get caught out. But there is this mutuality of that. So it is with our welfare system that is very generous, but we say, hey, it's a fair go mindset, and don't take advantage of it. Don't pull the other leg. Don't take it too far. And so it is with so many of our institutions. There's high trust, but there's also support there when it's needed, and there's the stick if people have taken it too far and done the dodgy or been the bludger, as we say. So that's been the system, and it's been both support of the individualist, but also it's been collective, and it's been egalitarian. It's been without the class system, and early on it's been diverse. We had the British coming, but we had the Irish as a key part of that. We had Protestantism, we had Catholicism, and we also had good interactions, and some of this has been well studied between those that arrived in the colonies and Indigenous Australians, and there's been a lot of bad relations there as well, but there's been a lot of that good, and we sometimes forget that. And so this diversity that then quickly flowed into those arriving from China, if we think about the gold rush period, and then we've been very diverse in our arrivals, apart from the White Australia Policy chapter. But we have been a nation settled through this diversity of migration, and therefore that reliance on each other and that connection across the groups has been core to what makes modern Australia.
Final issue to explore and pick your brain on is the disengagement of sub-30s, even sub-25s, the new voters from 18 to 25 who disengage essentially from conservatism. You identified that 90% of them are going to university, and that's a largely left-leaning philosophical greenhouse. But is there a way that is there something about that demographic which right-thinking people could better do to engage with those people and convince them, I guess, persuade them of our ideals and values and their merits for a flourishing Australia?
Yeah, Australians are always open to the common sense arguments. They are not just influenced by what the experts or authority figures say. It's also their own experience and that of those that they know. And so bringing balance to the debate is important. And I think, we discussed the overreach of political leaders and applying too much of that power. We've never gone well for that authoritarianism. It's not a land where any dictator can get by. We say that that person's up themselves. It's the land of the tall poppy, and someone gets too self-important and we pull them down, because it's an egalitarian society, and it's ultimately things come back to the central mainstream common sense view. And I think universities and particularly academia are in danger of that same overreach, of that same one-dimensional mantra that does cause the pushback. Australians have said to religious people through history, "Oh, you don't want to be a Bible basher." Well, the new Bible bashers, those that have the ideology that they are bashing around, is very much a left-leaning ideology in all of the usual suspect policy areas and perspectives that we know. And so the Bible bashing, the ideology bashing, is getting a bit much for a lot of Australians, and including young people and young men. And you've seen this a bit. We see the Jordan Peterson collective in North America and around the world, where particularly young men have heard so much of one dimension that they say, actually, we need a bit of balance in this debate. And I think what's important is that we have the space for the different views in Australia and in academia, because if it's just this one perspective that is pushed, you end up with sometimes a reaction that's not healthy. As has been said, if people have a problem with the religious majority or the religious right, wait till you see the irreligious right. We don't want that. What we need is just we need to uphold and maintain the foundations of our society that we've had, the Judeo-Christian foundations, and the common sense reality, the collectivist community mindedness, the care for others, and yet the support of the individual, government in its place doing what it does, not reducing ever more in size, but at the same time not growing in size either. That just the way Aussies have responded to things through history, we need that, because if we try to redesign things in this new wokeism left ideology, it's going to cause some breakouts in ways that are unhealthy and some pushback, rather than the common sense discussion and community conversations that have been key to our existence.
Yeah, brilliant. It's it's the question I get asked all the time, is how do we reach more young people? There's great crowds of over 40s, over 50s, and it actually gets bigger as we go up in age demographics at the Church and State Summit. But there's also a growing under 30s demographic at each year. And that's exciting, some of the baby boomers and Gen Xers, because they really, want to see good values, common sense ideas and balance have a strong foothold in the emerging and rising generations. And so I'm constantly asked, how do we get more people there? We need to brainstorm and focus on that. Do you think it's probably a statement of the obvious, but expand on the statement of the obvious, that the role of technology has to play, which can be positive, and also big tech, social media, giant corporations, which can be negative.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's definitely a digital generation that are shaped on, that are saturated with the devices and the social media platforms that fill those devices, and the amount of time they spend on screens, the age at which they've been exposed to the devices, and therefore the impact on them are profound. And a lot of social media does lean to the left, as we discuss, as does a lot of the mainstream media. But obviously, young people can use the channels to get a broader diet, to get broader insights, and to indeed look beyond the headline of what has popped up, and dig a bit deeper on that, do their own research on that, and connect up. But the other thing with this emerging generation, and probably with the technology and the saturation of policy views that again are one-dimensional, is that it does create a counter trend where ultimately they push back a bit on that. And we are seeing a more conservative generation emerge, firstly, and clearly conservative financially. They have seen now economic uncertain times. They've seen it for a decade. The GFC, they've seen it since COVID. They've seen our recession, the first here in Australia in 3 decades. They've seen that suddenly 1 million people can be put out of jobs almost overnight. They've seen that the economy goes up and the stock market, but it can go down. They've seen that you do need money for a rainy day. You do need to save. Things don't come easy. And that it does require hard work and saving and planning and reducing of expenses to get that Aussie dream a reality. And I think that financial conservatism and the fact that you do have to make a go of things, and you can't just rely on on parents or on welfare or indeed on job for life does create a sense of what our grandparents knew. That you have to save money, you have to look at your spending, you have to bit by bit grow, and through investing in asset appreciating things like homes, not just the stuff of life that depreciates. That's the way to get by. And I think that's a healthy experience that they have been through. And often with that financial conservatism comes some of the social conservatism as well, where they say, well, look, that's an area not for government to dwell in. And I don't want to keep paying more tax or levies in this area or that, because while most Australians are very supportive of the tax system and again of much of the welfare, there are limits to that when it goes too far, particularly with that financial conservatism that they're focused on. And Australians tend to value that hard work and have that rewarded. The quality of opportunity needs to be there, but the outcomes are going to be different based on how we handle and steward those opportunities. And young people see that, and they're starting to see that even more. So I do see this counter trend. I do see this emerging conservatism with a lot of young people, certainly in the financial way, and that probably flow into some level of political and policy conservatism as well, which inevitably happens as the counter trend to when things have headed in one direction for a while.
I said this would be the last topic, and so I think it's kind of related, but I just have to ask this one question. If I was left-wing Labor, progressive, classic, liberal, what would you recommend to me as the strategy to reach more young people? What would be the sensitive spot to, or the arguments to convey to bring them into voting for a Labor government or other left-wing government?
Well, it's ensuring that these young people who are seeing the financial opportunities that their parents and grandparents had increasingly out of reach. It's speaking to that. I mean, Labor have always been the party that has been for the working class, that has given the opportunities to move through those socioeconomics. We are a nation historically that's been very socioeconomically mobile. And there's been a lot of opportunity to move up the ranks. The socioeconomics is defined by the three things of income, of employment class, and of education. And we have open access in all of those areas. Education is available for all. Anyone can head to university or further studies beyond schools. There's lots of pathways there. Income, you can go from nothing to as a tradie, the average out-earning university graduate. A lot of mobility. You don't have to be a university graduate with a master's to out-earn, the plumber or the sparky or the builder's labourer. So great opportunities on the earnings and occupation. I mean, we respect the dentist and the doctor, and we respect the builder who's the one driving around in the flash new ute, and our suburbs are the great melting pot where you do have the specialist doctor, and 3 doors down you've got the property developer who never went to uni, or the real estate agent, or for that matter, the builder. So that's our suburbs, that's our society. And if thinking about that labor opportunity, if they now cannot provide that pathway anymore, if their policies have enabled the elite pathway over that of the ordinary everyday Aussie, if young people are seeing that the pathways are more limited, then they're losing that fertile ground that has been there. And I think that's part of the problem for Labor, is that they've become more a party of the elites and lost that blue collar, or what we would say the high-vis collar of today, because young people are feeling frustrated, feeling locked out, feeling that there is a have and have not, and it's a generational have and have not. It's not, and the pathways that their parents knew don't seem to be as open for them.
Yeah, very good insights, Mark. I really appreciate your time and your brain. And for those of you who want more of Mark, you can look forward to the Church and State Summit in the last weekend in February. There's a waiting list before tickets go on sale at churchandstate.com.au. Mark, really appreciate your time. And for anybody who wants more of Mark now, head to McCrindle.com.au. That link is on your screen. That's MCCRINDLE, McCrindle.com.au. Mark McCrindle, thanks so much for joining me on Pellowe Talk today.
Thank you, Dave. It's been a pleasure to chat. Thanks, Dave.
If not now, then when will we see an end to all this pain? Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.